ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 18. And we've got a tough subject today. As I often do, I gave some folks a heads up on Facebook promoting the sermon in the church. And it was amazing what kind of response you get from people about forgiveness. It's a hot topic, and mostly it's because so many of us just struggle to forgive. The title today is Don't Lose Sight of Grace. But if you look at the screen, it's John 1:16, and it's just a reminder of the grace that we receive. We're talking Jesus here, and for from His fullness we have all received what? Grace upon grace. So here's the scene. Matthew chapter 18, starting at verse 21. Then Peter came up and said to Him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Now, just a little background behind Peter. He's such a numbskull. I just want you to know, Peter is not the sharpest knife in the drawer sometimes. I love Peter. He's a fascinating person. I just love the way he leaps off the page, and it's just like, really? So the standard for forgiveness, according to the rabbis, was 3 times. Most commentators take and look at Peter's question and they say he's just trying to score points. So he's doubled that and added 1. He's gotten to the perfect number 7. And so here's Peter, comes to Jesus, and I'm guessing he's done something stupid with one of the other apostles. You know, I don't know. It doesn't say anything about that, but I'm thinking this is what's going on. So, Lord, let me score some points with you. How often? 7? Notice how Jesus responds. I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times, or 70 times 7. It depends on how you translate the Greek. So it depends on your translators. But most of us tend to take that number 70 times 7. 490 times. How many of you keep track? Have you got a logbook? Can you just kind of keep track of that? You know, it's you follow people around and, well, I don't know, that was number 399. You're running out. Yeah, that's at home. Why do we struggle so much? Yeah, Bill's not here, so I have to add some of his little quips. Next screen, bud. Why is forgiving so difficult? Have you ever thought about that? When we mess up, we want forgiveness, and because we're in church, let's not go for the Bible answer. Let's just do an everyday, this is a no-brainer. When you've messed up, whose grace do you want to come out? No. Maybe I need to ask it a different way. Keep in mind what day today is. What person in your life is the best exemplar of grace? Mom! Yeah! I mean, when we messed up, we want Mom's grace. When somebody is messed up against us, we want Judge Wapner, right? For those of us who remember Judge Wapner. When I was in Montana at the meth treatment center, what an interesting place. It was part of it is part of the prison system of Montana. You had to, when I first got there, you had to have had 2 meth convictions in the state of Montana. Keep in mind, some of these guys had dozens throughout the Northwest. But you had to have 2 meth convictions in the state of Montana in order to even be considered to be put in the meth treatment center. It was prison, There were guards, there was barbed razor wire, there were fences, you're a prisoner. But it was a treatment program. It is a 9-month treatment program. You go in there, and it is very much psychological. So your first 10 days, and I would see it invariably with every one of the prisoners that came in, those first 10 days were, it was kind of funny. They'd have to wear these gray sweats, nondescript, and just pull them off the shelf. Somebody else had been wearing them for 10 days, just last, a couple weeks ago, and somebody before that, It just, you're nothing. You're nobody. And these guys would be scared. You would then go into phase one, and keep in mind the orientation guys, the guys in the gray, would see everything that was going on. They were going through the classes. And what they had to look forward to is their next phase, their first 3 months, was phase one. The very first thing you did, if you were in that program, was take your latest criminal offense, and you would spend every spare moment you had for days, even weeks, of charting everything from what you thought, what you said, what were your triggers, everything that dealt with that criminal offense, and then you gave your presentation before, and it would be a group that surprisingly looks a lot like you guys, except for the females. I just never thought, this is like preaching a sermon. So anyway, you would give this presentation, and then the crowd would rip you apart. Now, I've been part of that. One of the guys that I did that, it's called the criminal cycle. And so they've put down everything that they think they thought. And the truth is, just like everybody else, they were fooling themselves about their criminal cycle. So one of the guys that I did this for, his son had been in my classes at the junior high. Little guy named Tristan. You just wanted to, you wanted to adopt this kid. He's living with another family. But his mom had died from an overdose when he was 3.5 years old. He was home alone with her, and her body was laying there with a needle stuck in her arm. And that's how he first got rescued. He ends up with Dad. Guess what Dad does? Same exact thing. He does OD. He's got the needle in his arm. He doesn't die. But the surprise, and the kid is a little bit older at this point. But the boy, Tristan, then is the one who shares with the authorities what Dad has done. And Dad ends up in prison. Here was why I wanted to be there. Number one, I love that kid. Yeah, just a great young man. But I wanted to be there for that criminal cycle because I knew it was going to happen. I had seen it so many times. But this guy is justifying why he did what he did. But more importantly, what he did not say to these guys that I knew from talking to his son was he blamed his son for his actions. So he would get on the phone and play this guilt trip on his son, blaming his son for the reason he was in prison. Pretty pathetic, isn't it? Now fast forward, you get to 9 months, and it's been a brutal 9 months. They break it down, they then start the building process, and just help you reconstruct your thinking, and you go through graduation. Now, like I've said, these are experienced criminals. They've burned through everybody. Here comes graduation, and as you talk to the family members, the girlfriends or the wives, or just the brother, or some of the folks who would show up, almost everybody to an individual, to the last person except for one, was pretty skeptical. Well, I've seen this before. We'll see if this one takes. Except for one person If mom happened to be alive, guess what mom was? I think he's going to make it this time. Mom was hopeful. Mom was forgiving. Mom was the one who's just rooting for the kid. He could have been an axe murderer. And guess what mom's saying? Well, isn't it? So here we are on Mother's Day, and we're talking grace, and we do, don't we, want forgiveness like mom gives. But that's so hard. Think about human beings and just how inconsistent we are about forgiveness. We can forgive a stranger for pulling in front of us at Walmart in the parking lot, or not. Some of us don't. But we can go to church with the same people for 30 years, and if they don't acknowledge our birthday, man, we're changing churches. Don't we? What else are we inconsistent about? What about some of the biggies? Like a cheating spouse. Those sort of things. Those big, horrible, you just can't forgive. Have you ever paid attention to how Jesus, actually in the next chapter, he talks about forgiveness still, but he's talking husband and wife. He says, you've forgotten what it was like from the beginning. And he quotes the Old Testament, he quotes two passages in the book of Genesis. And he says, you've forgotten what it was like from the beginning. Moses gave you divorce because, anybody, here's the little trivia question. What's the because? Because of your hard hearts. My wife is wrong. I'll call her out. The preacher's wife did not know her Bible. No. Man, this is tough. Yeah, this is taking an ugly turn. No, he's talking divorce, and he says, no, you take a wife, and in today's audience, he would say, you take a husband too. I mean, he'd be inclusive. But he says, you're supposed to be in this forever, and you're given divorce, but only for one reason alone, and that's if you spoil the marriage bed. But that is allowed us, he says, by Moses, only because of our hard hearts. God doesn't even really want to let us off the hook on adultery. He wants us to learn this concept of forgiveness. So it all starts with this. This is Peter's question. Let's just figure out what else Jesus has to say, because this is a big, big passage. Matthew 18. So starting in verse 23. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven... Wait, Jesus, this is one of the kingdom parables. We're talking kingdom, and you're saying forgiveness is like the kingdom of heaven? Let's unpack this. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. A talent was a lifetime income. This guy owed the king 10,000 lifetimes. So you just do the math. You figure out how much you've made in your 40, 50 years of work. Multiply that times 10,000. That's the debt this guy owed. So one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had in payment to be made. If you had that at the bottom of your credit card statement, would you sign? So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of, what's the word? Pity. Compassion. Actually, compassion is a better translation. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. That's about 50 days' wages. How much does he owe? 10,000 lifetimes. How much does this poor schmuck owe him? Couple of months. 50 days. And what does he do? So, owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, "Pay what you owe." This is a nice scene, Jesus. I'm thinking the kingdom of heaven is going to be an interesting place. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." Now remember, the king says, "You begged me, okay, I'm letting you off the hook." He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what it, you start to call your friends. Somebody just asked, how do you pay that? You start to call your friends. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" And in his anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. How many friends do you have? Hey, I know you've got a spare denarii or two. Can you give me a lifetime loan? So also, verse 35, "My heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." Hold on to that one. You might want to underline that. We're going to come back to it. Now, here's one of our confusions in this passage. When we define forgiveness, we think that forgiveness and grace are just like this story, that it's about letting the person off scot-free. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story was the attitude of the unjust servant, who, being forgiven much, did not forgive. And that's what Jesus is comparing us to. So we'll unpack that some more. But I just want to give you a little illustration. This, for those who are with us for the first time today, I've been weaving in this story of Ernest Shackleton. Ernest Shackleton was an explorer who in 1914 to 1917 took two ships, landed them, or tried to get down to Antarctica, and he wanted to cross Antarctica. 128 degrees below zero, 200-mile-an-hour winds. It's 1914, you're wearing wool clothing. This is a big deal. And you're sailing in wooden ships. The reason Ernest Shackleton is famous is because they didn't make it, but on his boat, all 28 men survived. Now, the reason I'm using this illustration is, take a look at Shackleton. This is on the expedition. Keep in mind, how old do you think he looks right now? He's just a tad over 40. Can you imagine landing on the ice in the Weddell Sea? Your ship is crushed. You've got 27 other men with you. And their lives you hold in your hands. You're responsible for them. But more than that, guess whose fault it is that you're on the ice? Whose brainstorm was going down there? Ernest Shackleton. Who chose a ship with narrow sides that when the ice closed in, as opposed to the Aurora, which was on the other side of the Antarctic, it had a rounded bow. And so when the ice moved in and started to push that, guess what happens to those ships? It just pushes you up on top of the ice. But for a narrow ship with a deep keel, he keeps you down in the water, and that ice comes in, and it just crushes you. And as for those who've heard the story, here's the bow of the ship, that front part, solid oak, 4 feet wide, 8 feet tall. It's amazing, the kind of pressure that's there. All the men get dumped out, and by the way, who was listening to the whalers? They said, it's an unusual year. We've got a lot of ice out there, and it's farther north than it's ever been before in known history. Well, I'm still going to go. Ernest Shackleton. Can you imagine landing on the ice with no radio? It's not being used yet. You've got 69 dogs, a cat, 28 men, and whatever you could rush it off the ship. And the guy in charge is the guy who made the decision to get there, and he got you into this mess. Do you think maybe there might have been some blame? Just. And so, no wonder he looks like he does. He's just barely 40 years. He only lives to 47. He dies of a massive heart attack on his way down there yet again in 1921. But I would think part of the reason was because of the pressures that he went through trying to survive this and being responsible for those men. So these 27 men come back, they all survive. Everybody survives, and they all write these diaries. And guess what? After I've painted this picture of Ernest Shackleton, and he's made a lame brain sort of choice to get down there, guess what those 27 men all say about Ernest Shackleton? Thumbs up. Man, that's the guy. If you're going to go down and get trapped on the ice, you want Ernest Shackleton in charge. Would you have been like that? Come on, it's his responsibility. He's at fault. Man, let's do something. Let's raise up a committee, and we're going to do something about this. We're going to call the Washington Post. He warned them. He warned them. He did warn them. Now, all of that's going on. They come back, and there's this British medal. It's called the Polar Medal. King George VI, is King of England, and Shackleton sends a list of his men's names to get the Polar Medal with all the 4 names. Here's the 4. Ernest Holness, William Stevenson, John Vincent, and Chippy McNish. Those are the 4 guys. Nobody knows why those 4 guys did not get honored with the Polar Medal. Now, keep in mind, every one of them carried their weight. The first 3 guys, by the way, were all in their 20s. Here's my personal maybe. They just also happen to be, keep in mind, almost everybody else is a doctor, an engineer, a geologist, the professional guys. And a lot of them are, they're stumped. So that's what they are. These guys are sailors, with the exception of the last guy. The last guy was a carpenter, one of the best carpenters in the world. He used hand tools in 1914 and 1917 to help them survive by taking leftover bits and pieces. I mean, he took 2-inch screws, put it in their shoes as they're trying to track across South Georgia Island. And I mean, this guy was phenomenal. That's the one guy almost everybody agrees was, his picture is next. Cheers, Chippy McNish. He's a Scotsman, and Scotsmen can be, is anybody Scotch in here? Yeah, I just want to be careful, because Scotsmen, wait, you're a redhead, Irish, right? Yeah, okay. So, He's a Scotsman. He's tough. You barely understand him. Oh, by the way, he was a Scottish Presbyterian, and he hated. Here you go. I have been shipmates with all sorts of men, both in sail and steam, but nothing like some of our party. He's talking about this ship of 28. As the most filthy languages used as terms of endearment, and worst of all is tolerated. So he was a little bit of a snob himself, a religious snob. Interestingly enough, his first two wives had died. His third wife, he divorced her, I'm guessing because he's a jerk, and she did the math. Because his fourth wife, who wasn't his wife, she was living with her, he left her in 1925, went to New Zealand and just abandoned her with the kids in England. Am I painting the picture? Well, he gave Shackleton a hard time. Do you see the little kitten right there? That's Mrs. Chippy. Mrs. Chippy, by the way, is a tomcat. It's a guy. So Mrs. Chippy really wasn't Mrs. She was Mr. But Shackleton, when the ship was crushed, and ordered that the cat and the puppies, remember that picture last week? And he's holding that was Chippy that was holding the puppies. He orders them killed, and Chippy never forgave Shackleton. Gave him a hard time. We don't know what happened on that ice. One of the things these guys were great at was they kept some stuff close to their vest, and they just didn't share some things. There's one thing Shackleton said of Chippy. He says, "I'll never forgive him for his rebellion on the ice." There's two different accounts. At one point, McNish apparently tried to just say, "Hey, the boat's gone. You have no dominion over me. I want to build a new boat. Get off of this. I don't want to do it your way." And so Shackleton, either one, had the Articles of War read to him, or pulled out his gun and threatened to blow his brains out. Nobody knows really what happened because they didn't say. But apparently there was some lack of forgiveness that was taking place there. Have you ever been there? Have you been that angry at someone? And what Jesus is saying here is this sort of anger. You can't have that. As a matter of fact, the kingdom of heaven is, well, it's built on forgiveness. It is. And so, next one. It's not that we should forgive, but that we must forgive. Now, I have to tell you, this sort of sermon has wounded a lot of people. Because we're put under this, the power of the Bible and God's love, and it's saying you have to forgive, otherwise you can't get into heaven. And have you been so wronged, so hurt, so beat up by somebody else that it seems unfair that God would say to you, you have to forgive, otherwise we lock the gates of heaven when you show up? Let me unpack for you just the beauty of what Jesus teaches in the New Testament. So it's not that we should forgive, but that we must forgive. So here's the first thing to remember. Here's why. For your own self. Anger, hurt, malice, resentment injure us physically. This issue has been studied by Christian psychologists, counselors to no end. So the best books out there are written by Christian psychologists. And what doctors have concluded is this. When you don't forgive, you release all the chemicals of the stress response. And that's by Dr. Frederick Luskin. Healing is inhibited. You have an increased risk of heart disease and hypertension. Have you ever you spend your days just thinking about the wrong that somebody else has done to you? If you think about it more than 20 times a day, and it's surprising how often we do, that you just obsess about what this person has done, that's killing you physically. Now, conversely, studies show that patients who forgive get better in all these categories. There's one doctor who's retired now. He wrote a textbook on it. He was a burn doctor. One of his case studies was a fellow had fallen into a vat of molten aluminum, 950 degrees, up to his knees, and it was the fault of the supervisor. So this doctor just slowly and methodically walked them through the steps of calming down and forgiving. And the guy, here's this strange thing. Normally, in that sort of burn, they have to amputate or they have to do massive skin grafts. The treatment was so effective, they didn't have to do skin grafts, and they didn't have to do amputation. And it's all based on forgiveness. So point one is it harms us physically. It injures us. But anger, hurt, malice, and resentment harm us mentally too. You have a higher incidence of depression. You deal with that, you go to the doctor, what are they doing? They're pushing pills at you, you need to take more pills. No, how about learning let's find out, is there somebody you haven't forgiven? You might be depressed because it's just driving you into the toilet because that's all you think about is what somebody else has done to you. You have a higher incidence of anxiety and hostility. But here's another crazy thing that happens. Rational thought is hindered. You can't think rationally. Do you know somebody who's that angry at someone else? That they just literally go off the deep end and they're not thinking rational thoughts? That's what the lack of forgiveness does to us. Conversely, mood improves, as does optimism and hope when we learn how to forgive. Here's the third one. Anger, hurt, malice, and resentment destroy us eternally. And that's where preachers do the damage, because we go immediately to that. Here's the passage. You remember Matthew 6, right after teaching us how to pray? Jesus teaches, here's two verses that they're so uncomfortable. If you forgive, you get into heaven. But if you don't forgive, your heavenly Father will not forgive you. You got it? Here's verse 14. If you forgive your brother on earth, your heavenly Father will forgive you. But if you do not forgive, verse 15, your heavenly Father will not forgive you. So how do you get out of this? Here's some easy steps. We'll run through them real quick. Here's the practice of grace. Number one, expose the emotional landmines of resentment. When you hold something against someone else,